Hello, welcome everyone to the Peace Tribe Rising podcast. This podcast is the podcast of the Middle East Peace Civic Forum, which are the banners behind myself and Peter. And our guest today is Bill Phillips. He's a practitioner of Neuro-Linguistic Programming. And Bill, you facilitated our last two conversation series here at the Middle East Peace Civic Forum. And we had, in one case, an Israeli and Palestinian, in the second case, myself as a Jewish peacemaker in communication with a Palestinian, and we had just really interesting discussion. So we'll get into that more and get to know you better. And I'm Matt Lakenbach. I'm the executive director of the Middle East Peace Civic Forum, and we started this organization with a mission to really move the needle on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and create an opening for more effective ways to communicate and ultimately guide the way to peace. So we're passionate about that here. That topic is of keen interest to us, and we'll get into that today. So my co-host today is Peter Van Geldern. Peter is one of the co-founders of the Middle East Peace Civic Forum with me and also on our board of directors. And Peter is very experienced with facilitation and peace work and communication as well. So we have the stage set for a really interesting and dynamic discussion today. So Peter, is there anything you'd like to say? You want to ask Bill the first question?
Well, I think you said it best. We want to get to know Bill. I certainly want to know more about his background. All of us share professional peacemaking, and communication skills. And a lot of our work, Matt, comes from our leadership work and the distinctions we bring to these conversations. So I think we've really learned that Bill also brings like a whole body of distinctions to peacemaking. So those were kind of my first questions were, his background, and then also we have a few more really interesting questions we'll bring in later about his experience being Irish and the connection to the history of Ireland.
Well,
Also,
he's English, but in Ireland currently.
in Ireland, that's right, English and Ireland. Well, we want to hear more about that than your background, your training. So why don't you kind of give us a little update on how you got here, Bill,
Mm,
your
okay.
journey.
I guess the journey that's relevant in NLP started 40 years ago, maybe a little more, in 1988. I was the training manager at Manchester Airport at the time, and I've been trained in a team building kind of a questionnaire or a team building instrument called TMS. And one of the authors of that had done a study, and he published a book in 1988 called How to Influence Others at Work. And I thought, that sounds very interesting. I'm going on that. And basically, it was a study of NLP. It was a study of what's called the meta model, a language model in NLP, and another language model called the Milton model. And really, it was a fusion of both. I went to his bibliography at the end of the course, a 3-day course, and bought all of the books. There were 17 of them, I think, and they were all NLP books. And I read them all from cover to cover and put them into practice straight away because I was so excited.
So how does NLP work? Give us the juice.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about it, but fundamentally, the way I describe it is it's a deep study in how we communicate with ourselves and other people. And so really, with NLP, you learn how memories are stored, how memories are made, how beliefs are stored and made, and how, if you like, each person makes a model of the world that they live by. And this is accessed by their language, by their neurology, which takes in information about the world, and all of that combines to program the way you operate. and so that's fundamentally the name of it. And maybe
Yeah, neuro-linguistic programming. I don't know if it's an acronym. NLP is an acronym, right, for neuro-linguistic programming.
exactly right. And actually, just an aside, that the name NLP was a joke, which they later realised it had stuck, and they couldn't change it.
What was the
So,
joke?
well, because NLP started as something called meta, and Frank Puselic, who was one of the three men who started it, registered the name Meta as a business name, which was what it was. But then they all fell out, and they were, at the time, John Grinder and Richard Bandler, who are really noted as the developers of NLP, said, well, we better give it a name. What name should we give it? And Frank thought, well, they ain't going to buy it off me now because they couldn't be bothered before. And so they said, well, why don't we call it something like neuro-linguistic programming? It sounds really scientific and
It stuck.
and they said we can always change it later. But the trouble was it created such popularity that they realized 6 months down the line they couldn't change it. It stuck now. That's what it was called. And so that's what it.
Well, isn't that ironic, right? Because that's the whole zeitgeist of the thing, that your language creates your reality.
Yeah,
And here they just did it by accident.
that's it.
That's right. They created words that became their reality. Too bad it didn't stay. You didn't stick with Meta. I think Mark Zuckerberg might have bought
know.
that name from you for millions of dollars.
Well, that's right. Of course, he couldn't if he kept it registered. But I asked Frank about that, and he said, "Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't know that I was supposed to re-register it every year, and I didn't do that." So
Meta.
basically, yeah, Meta.
Well, so that'll be our little secret that we're going meta here.
Yeah.
Well, meta is an interesting word too, because meta, in a sense, is like one step back. Like meta is like speaking, designing, creating. It's like a one click back to observe yourself. And I think that's probably an interesting connection we have with our work, Bill. There's sort of an observer. The observer is present. So we get to stop, hear what's in our languaging or listening, and notice it, and then manage it in a way that we can kind of choose newly or see what's going on in our own selves. I don't know. Does that make sense? Like that's probably where the word meta came from when they originally started it.
It was they actually the very first expression or capturing of the stuff in written form was in a book about it was called The Structure of Magic, Volume 1. But it was about the meta model for language. And so the meta model really was the foundation of NLP, and really it runs through everything that makes up NLP anyway. And so really, as a trainer, I was concerned that many of the trainers who came to us for training as a trainer didn't know the meta model well enough to be able to teach it to other people. And so I devised a set of recordings which allowed people to learn it much quicker and much more completely. And those recordings they're still there. And so the meta model really is the foundation for NLP anyway.
And can you explain the meta model, like in your training, like what would be, if I took your course, like what's sort of the main takeaways from the meta model?
Yeah, well, the meta model really allows you to have a conversation. And the thing about the meta model is it's not content related. So it doesn't matter what you're talking about, it works. Because it's a meta model, it's not involved in the content, it stands above or behind
One
the
step
content.
back, exactly. Yeah, there you go.
And so it consists of 14 patterns in language, which how can I put it? You might say, for example, I have a problem, blah, blah, blah. And I might say, as the therapist, what problem is that specifically? Or it's really hard and I'm finding it difficult. Oh, what's hard? what is it that you're finding difficult? Um, or can you just shut that door? The there's a draft. And someone says, yeah, sure. And they get up and shut the door. You didn't ask them to shut the door. You just said, can you shut the door? The answer is yes or no. But they take it as a command. And so when you understand these kind of nuances of language, you really understand how to get to the bottom of what people are saying. As well, the fact is that when someone speaks, they're only speaking a précis of what they really thought in the first place. So if you imagine a thought leads to what they say, then the thought is the complete description. And what they say is just like a thin surface structure. And so what asking them meta model questions, when you recognize the patterns in their language and you challenge those patterns, that forces them to go back to the original thought they had and give you more. But in fact, what it really does, which is the purpose of it, is it makes them go back and they get more. And so they start to explain their problem, if you like, and they explain it as best they can. And then you ask them a few questions and they explain it again. And you ask them a few more questions and they explain it again. And then they think, oh, actually, I re-understand it now. And when they re-understand it, all of a sudden, what was the problem just isn't a problem anymore.
That's so awesome. Yeah, we have similar technologies like a recreation or mirroring, but I think many times we also end up, you find out what people are committed to or they're standing for. Like you'll find an underlying commitment which is buried in a lot of their language, like
Exactly. But with NLP, the meaning and the use of the meta model is to make them reassess what they've said. It isn't to gain information. And so, like when I've said sometimes when I'm just facilitating a conversation, I'm not listening to what they say because I know that whatever it is they say, I will interpret it differently from the way they're interpreting it. And since they're the ones who had the problem, not me, then they have to, I leave it with them, so to speak. And I'm listening off the top of the patterns in their language. And I only intervene in the discussion when there's something that needs correcting or something that needs redirecting, so to speak. And if there isn't anything, I don't say anything at all.
it sounds like a mastery and facilitation, right? It's really where some of the core tools of facilitation would be not to be chiming in with your opinions and your own, like interpretations of the meanings of what's going on, but to facilitate is holding space and stepping back and watching for patterns or repeating what you hear, or so that they can see for themselves what or redecide. Is that what you said? They need to they can redecide what it means for them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so and also you see when somebody speaks, when somebody gives an explanation, there's only one way that I can understand it, and that is for me to interpret it. So my interpretation won't ever match their meaning. And if it did, I'd never know. And so what's the point of me listening to their story if their story is really only a metaphor for whatever model of the world they have? And therefore, what happens is, instead of interpreting their story and calling it the truth or believing it's the truth, I just don't interpret their story. I leave that with them. I just listen to the language they're using. And if they say anything that needs re-explaining, that is re-explaining for themselves, not me, then that's when I intervene. And so someone might use a pattern several times. And so I might intervene and say, just hold it there a minute. You said this. Did you mean this? and just leave it. And The fact is, I don't know whether they did or not, but it seems significant because they said it several times. And therefore, I picked on it and said, reprocess that, so to speak.
So it's an interruption in a sense. You're
Well,
picking up on something.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's
So
a pattern.
because if I listen to the content itself, then all that happens is I'll have opinions about it.
Mm.
And so in my training, for example, over the years, I mean, before I ever came into contact with NLP, I was trained as what was called a learning set advisor, a learning set. So action learning sets.
Talk more about that.
Yeah, well, action learning was a form started back in the 1930s with an Englishman called Reg Revans, and he discovered that scientists in the university used to gather at, to have a coffee in the coffee lounge and so on, and he found it rather interesting that they often talked about their experiments, and one of them would say something like, "Oh yeah, I've been doing this for years and years. I've spent 5 years on it now. I'm sure I'm just about that much close to solution. But do you think I can think of it? I can't for the life of me." And other people who knew nothing about what they were talking about said, "Well, had it ever occurred to you to do so and so?" No, no, no. Oh, hang on a minute. And he'd go away and experiment and come back and say, "Hey, it worked. That was it. That was what I needed." And
Fresh thinking.
yeah, and he said that happens so many times that you've got a group of people who really don't know one another's technology, if you like, and yet somehow by these kind of discussions they would help one another.
Welcome to this podcast.
Yeah. And so what he did was, sorry, my earplugs has come out. What he did was turn that into a leadership development program, and so it became quite famous. And they realised that to make it run smoothly, you needed a facilitator. And so I was trained back in 1980, I think it was 81, as a learning set advisor. So when I came to NLP, I was already a facilitator, quite skilled at watching groups of people and seeing the dynamics happen. And what I realized in that training was every now and again I would start thinking about what they were saying and I would start trying to follow. And when I was doing that, I was losing some of what the others were saying. And so I realized I couldn't track. And then I realized that after I kind of acquired some NLP and realized that I couldn't really understand their content, I could only understand my interpretation, then I thought, well, if I stop interpreting, then I don't have a problem, because the trouble I had then was I didn't understand what they were saying because I wasn't paying attention to it. So I thought, oh, what can I do about this? It was like a real challenge until I realized that if I didn't listen to what they were saying, what there was going on in my head was nothing. I was actually silent. And I thought, that means I can actually hear what everyone says because I'm not making meaning out of it. I'm just simply hearing the words and saying, what do the words seem to mean, or what do they seem to say? And maybe that's what I talk about. And so that's what I do. I realize that if someone comes up with a pattern of language or a statement or a particular point of view, and it happens several times, I think there's something significant there. I don't know what it is. I'm going to ask. And so I'd say, what do you mean by that? And then they come up with an explanation. And I realized that it's that kind of quietness in my mind so that I'm not interrupted from listening to the words. But it isn't the story that I'm listening to, it's just the words that are coming out of their mouth. And it's that I work with when I'm facilitating. And what I've found in doing that, in working with, say, 100 people in a room, I can listen to everyone. I can hear everyone. And because I'm not trying to take it in and make sense of it and interrupting the listening. And so
Right.
the listening is left free, so to speak.
Wow, this is so awesome. I facilitate about 20 people once a week in my hemp hub call, and I'm training myself also just to hold space and come from nothing. I'm hearing a lot of similar languaging in our work to yours, Bill, which is like coming from nothing. We say coming from nothing is actually a distinction that we use. And also, significance is a distinction, which is like, bring sounds. We often say, like, that sounds like you're bringing a lot of significance to this, you're, and which is another distinction, like around meaning and stories, like significance can stop us from growing. Like we're bringing so much significance to something in our lives. It means so
Of
much.
course,
We
also,
get stuck.
yeah, but of course, also when you use the word like significance, people will interpret that in their own way, and it may mean something to the rest of the group that it doesn't mean to you. That's the
It's so
trouble.
meta.
We get
It,
attached to our significance.
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
Attachment.
so in using this work to impact a situation like Israelis and Palestinians, of course, there's a lot of individuals involved who affiliate with different communities to varying extents. So it's not like you just have party A and party B. In fact, you've got a real diverse landscape of people and groups and opinions and perceptions. And at the end of the day, you're talking about millions of individuals, each with their own unique exposures and
exactly.
opinions. So how do you kind of begin to approach a very complicated story like that?
Yeah. Well, one thing's for sure, nobody will ever be clever enough to resolve it, to get them all to agree. And so you don't even try. What you do is you go to where people are and what they are saying and what they need to say. And really, I suppose part of the art of that kind of talk is to know what it is that needs to be said and who needs to say it. Um, and so all you can do is start the conversation and seeing what's said and seeing what reaction is, and decide either to stop that reaction, to let that flow a bit, even though other people are getting agitated, so that the person gets it off their chest, if you like. But
Yeah.
I think also the only way that agreement can be reached is if everyone forgets what's happened up until now. And that's the difficulty. I mean, John Grinder was asked actually by one of the Saudi princes in an audience he had one day, what do you think the solution to the Middle East problem is? And John went,
Amnesia.
amnesia.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's like in Men in Black where they hold up the light and
Exactly.
it sends a bright, what
Yeah,
happened?
take a look right here.
yeah, yeah. And
Well, you're right. So hitting
almost
the
sounds
reset.
funny,
Yeah.
but that's
Yeah.
it. If you can hear people and
So
they
in
can,
our in the work Peter and I do, we distinguish between not so much forgetting, but the idea is we call it being complete with. So it's not that you necessarily forget, because people want to honor the past, I think, but to say, okay, it happened, but you know what, we're just going to declare that that's complete, and we're going to choose in this moment how to create our relationship going forward. And so that begins a new conversation, right?
mm, yeah,
Mhm.
and I think if people can just uh, sort of allow themselves to do that, it's a bit like coaching when you're coaching an individual who's got a past that is blocking him from doing something or achieving something now. We all have our past with us, don't we? We all kind of, traumas and so on. Um, it's the same thing. You don't say, look, you've got to forget all of that and just start here. You can't possibly say that to an Israeli or a Palestinian who's actually in Israel suffering all of that misery right now. You just can't. But what you can do is say, do you want to talk about it? And do you want to talk about it with these people or with this person? And do you want to open up and just say? And bearing in mind that what you say might upset someone else. And so you've got to have an agreement up front which says, look, something that gets said might upset you. If you do, notice what you feel, but notice where you feel it. And so because people, they get their feelings and they name the feeling and then they act them out. But there's a way of thinking about feelings, which is, I feel it here. It feels like a rising up or a nausea or whatever. And what I say to people is, just feel it. Feel the feeling where it is. Notice where it is in your body and don't act it out. Just say, I notice it, I acknowledge it, and I keep listening. Now that takes some practice, of course, which is what you're doing when you're having a conversation, is you're practicing having a conversation and saying what you need to say. When people can do that, and they can do that, they have a surprising capacity to do that. When you can get them to do that, then you can have a conversation. It's a conversation person to person, human to human, which is going to solve the problem. Because when humans can have a conversation, and even though they had terrible trauma and terrible, they've done awful things to one another, if they can hear sorry, if they can hear the feelings, if they can speak the feelings, then they are on their road to healing. The only time when the healing will be stopped is when someone says, yes, but.
Yeah, that's right. But these powerful words, like, instead of saying and, you say but, and it changes the vibe right away. So that the language is very interesting. Talk more about that, Bill, because you're really talking about like a kinesthetic. It's the way language lives in our body, in our nervous system. So is that part of your training, Bill? Do you can you talk a little bit more about like a sophisticated like understanding of how language occupies our nervous system or our body and how to release it, was sometimes called shadow work or trauma, or what is your training point to?
Yeah, well, if you can imagine that our body, our mind, they're not separate. They're not even related. They're not part of the same thing. They are the same thing. In other words, my mind is my body doing what it does, and my body is my mind doing what it does. Because without the mind, the body's just a lifeless mass of flesh. And so, if you understand the relationship between the brain and the body, you realize that if you're talking to someone, you're talking to the whole of them, not just their brain. And words like yes, but, and so on are very powerful, because in a language structure, but is always followed by a denial, whereas and isn't. And so you can say, so for example, people might have a problem where two things are opposite, and you say, yes, but this happened. And you say, yes, and what can happen instead is. And so you add things up, and you realize that you don't necessarily have to stop. You can keep it going by saying and. And when you do that, new possibilities, because and can fan out into so many different responses, whereas but only has one, which is no. To deny what came before it. And so when you learn little tricks like that, you realize that they're not tricks at all. They're actually smooth ways of smoothing out the wrinkles in a conversation, if you like. And so you use those automatically. So sometimes when there's a big group talking and there's someone saying, yes, but you say, hang on a minute, look, I just want you to notice the effect of the word but. Try and like this and that. Or I'll just say, and you know that's right. how do you mean right? Well, because, and when you explain what can come out of the other end of end, there's lots more options. They realize they're free from but. And so it's almost like you can stop a group using but just by training them to use and it only takes one or two examples, and then they start to use and when they do, you know they're on their way, and you can shut up and let them carry on.
Yeah, this is so as you originally said, you were looking at it because of team dynamics. You wanted to study probably, running a company or running groups. You can change the culture and the of a group with a couple of interruptions around using certain words. I really appreciate that. Like just a few infusions of like, no, our group doesn't use the word but, we use the word and then you just have to catch each other. And somehow we also often police each other too. Like, someone else will say, no, don't say but, so the training in teams or groups is really powerful to get I would say like conscious of language, and the power of language as a group can really elevate your work.
So we get very attached to our opinions, right? If I could pick up from you there, Peter, is that okay? Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
he's talking to me directly.
Well, because it is very interesting what your guys are pointing to here. And let's say you have a situation where an individual in a conflict is very attached to his or her position, and they're clear that they want to say but not and.
Mm.
They don't want to say and because they have a but. And that happens a lot in certain conflicts that we're familiar with. So, you know, how do you make allowance for that in the facilitation? What's the efficient and effective approach?
Yeah, I mean, it will depend on what's being talked about, but somebody might say, yes, but you've done this, or but I don't agree, or but, and so on. And what I would do is intervene there if I can see a way where the but is coming to a stop, so to speak. And I think, and what would happen if you said this instead, or what would happen if this happened rather than that? So it's called a reframe, where we deliberately give them another meaning for the same words. So you've said this and you've said this several times. Yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. What would happen if you said this, and, or some other word? And so it's almost like you try alternatives, say, what about this alternative? What about this alternative? And they may say, no, 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 no. And then all of a sudden you say one thing and they say, well, I suppose, yeah, all right. So let's go with that. And then they will move on. And that often happens in a group that's got conflict of any kind. Is I mean, I remember one conversation I was facilitating with the UK hydrogen fuel group, which was a grouping of manufacturers, all that would normally be competitors. But because they were all dealing with hydrogen fuel, they met once a year to say, look, what's the next steps? What's going on? What's happening? And we'd been going about an hour, I suppose, and all of a sudden these two men started shouting at one another. There was one who was representing a business group who was part funding some work, and there was another bloke who said, no, look, the trouble with you is you've always got. And I said, well, hang on a minute. And they wouldn't shut up. And I said, hang on a minute. Listen, wait, stop. Now listen. And what I said to one of them was, I realize that is very, very important to you, which is why you're getting so angry. If you're prepared to hold on to that and just listen to what is said, knowing that you think that, just hold on to it, listen to what is said, and when he said it, then you can have a go and you see what changes. And so he went, yeah, all right. He was about to leave and he didn't. And fortunately, he stayed. And after a while, they were actually agreeing because I could see the agreement, but they didn't think they were agreeing because they were using different words. And so, can you see how sometimes the people themselves think that they're opposed, but they realize that on another level, when it's presented to them, they're actually in agreement.
Mm.
And really, that's the way it works. Um, and so sometimes, Matt, that's what happens with someone who insists on but, is because
Yeah.
they have a point of view. They have something that happened or a strong view about something. And when you give them another view, they say, yes, that's all very well, but, and you say, yeah, but just if you follow it through a bit and see where it leads. And they say, well, when you put it like that, I say, well, what if we do put it like that? And and they say, yeah, well, that, so does that change it? And we move on. And
Mm.
Right.
and
Yeah.
I think it's a matter of keeping a conversation moving. That's the bit. Once the conversation stops because of something that someone says, that's when you need to intervene and start it up again. And so you need to challenge what it is. That
So how many hours do you think it'll take to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian matter?
well, the trouble is, of course, who is resolving it. You've got to get to the people that can have some say so that when they agree, then an agreement is made amongst large groups. And I think that's the complicated bit is who is responsible for it.
Who are the representatives?
Yeah. And unless you can get to them, then what you're going to do, which is what you've got really, is lots of pockets. Because I mean, let's face it, there are hundreds of people talking about peace and wanting peace. Um, uh, so why is it not happening? It isn't happening because the ones who need to be in that conversation are not the ones who are being talked to.
Right.
Argue the majority of people want peace, and maybe it's a small group that has some agenda that's they're not you're not getting to them, they're not listening, they're not in a conversation. So
Exactly.
Well, right. We talked about the distinction between having a clear victory. Sometimes in a conflict, there's that sense of having a clear victory. And then sometimes there's the pursuit of a negotiated settlement. And I think in our Middle East politics in the world today, you see a kind of a tug of war there. You've got some people saying, well, just let us have our victory and then this thing will be settled. And then you've got those saying, no, like let's come to the table. Let's have a ceasefire. Let's talk it out.
But you
How do
see,
you
when you think about it, somebody's asking for a ceasefire, someone else doesn't want the ceasefire.
yeah, and
And
on what
so,
terms?
yeah, and on what terms? It all gets very complicated. So again, you're back to the same trouble of trying to solve the problem. And really, what you've got to do is to get to the people and solve the people's problem with one another and with themselves. Because especially all of the people in Gaza and in Israel, they've all got a particular point of view. They've all got something terrible they've seen happen, but they can't live with. And how can you get them to agree? You can't.
mm,
But when you can get them in a room or get them in some way talking about what's happened, when they can talk out their problem, so to speak, and somebody else in the other room it maybe can listen to that problem, especially when it's one of them that has caused it, so to speak, and they can listen and say, I hear you and I understand. And then they can say the same and they can say, yes, I hear you and I understand. When people hear one another and understand, it doesn't matter what they're talking about, there comes a point where they can agree.
Right, right. And one of the
The problem all.
challenges, yeah, what was that?
No, it's just that. It's,
Yeah.
There's
One of the challenges is
Oh, I was going to say, one of the challenges is that sometimes there's peer pressure or societal pressure to avoid dialogue and to avoid engagement. It can be seen as normalizing an unfair situation.
mm,
So I would assert that it's really essential to emphasize the importance of being in communication with an understanding that the context is not one of enshrining an unfair situation, but of really authentically coming from a commitment to universal rights and responsibilities.
definitely, yeah.
uh,
And somehow what you need to do in the preamble to that is to come to an agreement about what we're going to do in this space and what we're going to discuss and what's allowed and what isn't allowed in order for the conversation to flow. And if you don't get that agreement, you're nowhere. Um, and sometimes the facilitation won't even start because you can't start it yet.
yeah, I worked about a decade in with a women's federation for world peace, and they brought together the women in both opposite camps and created dialogue. And we did it a ceremony too. We created a bridge ceremony where both sides would walk across a bridge and exchange flowers and hug, just as a symbol of reconciliation or listening. And it was a powerful work. But Matt mentioned that there was a role that the women played in bringing peace
Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because that was Matt and I had an interesting conversation today around like whether it was World War II or with the Japanese and the Germans, where there was a clear winning, and then peace sort of occurred after this bloody battle. But in the case of let's say Northern Ireland, there's actually negotiations, and maybe women brought a conversation to the table. So those are like these two different outcomes that we thought we'd want to bring to this podcast today. And can you speak a little bit about it? Actually, I probably don't know enough about how that conflict ended.
No, I don't know too much about it either. One of the things is, of course, that there are lots of people, I mean, it probably runs into their hundreds, who claim they resolved the problem in Northern Ireland. Some people say Tony Blair resolved it. But he was one person, and obviously he was a very influential one because he was in the politics. But there were lots of people involved. And one of the things was women who said, "Look, we've had enough. It's our men that are getting killed. It's our men that are driving this. Why don't we team up, us women, and put our point of view?" And I think that was really what it was that women said, "We're not standing for this anymore. We can't stand it anymore. What's happening to us? We're tearing one another apart." And so women started to talk about that on a large scale. And fortunately, I think some of those women were influential enough to persuade the men that they had to be listened to. Um, and so certainly, I know that I know enough about that movement, but no more than that, really.
Yeah. Sometimes people will say, well, it's time for the adults in the room to say enough is enough. There's a certain indignation around the conflict. But another way to look at it is that the people engaged in the conflict are coming from some sort of authentic drivenness, a sense of fairness and fighting for something noble. That's kind of how these things get created.
Mm.
So, there can be an integration, I think, between those energies. It's like we can honor our past, we can honor our struggle, but at the end of the day, it's time to move into a higher existence where basically we're just not slaughtering each other anymore.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? In the end, the only thing that can win people, is people that want peace, people that want an ordinary life where they can just get up, go to work, come home, and live their life. And
Mm.
in the end, it's the desire for that has to be stronger than all of the other desires to keep it away from people.
So you've now facilitated two series for the Middle East Peace Civic Forum Critical Conversation series. Are there any sort of vignettes that you'd like to point to or takeaways that you have from that discussion? Any areas of optimism?
Well, I mean, you remember we've had this conversation before that I had to see the videos afterwards to
Right.
realize what it was that was talked about. I mean, I think the wonderful thing is that Waleed and you and
Yehuda.
Yehuda wanted peace, and you wanted to talk about it, and the way you talked about it showed what you wanted. It also showed that you know what went on, what's gone on, what's led up to this conflict, and you're saying yes, but despite that, we still want this. So, if you like, you're the enlightened people, and I think it's that enlightenment which has to be catching to other people. You just need to get the right people in the room, because what you've all said leads directly to peace, if only the rest would agree to it.
Right, right. Yeah, well, it's an interesting time in our world now where we have the Biden administration is in its waning days, and the President-elect Trump and his transition team are fast at work, bringing in new appointees and thinking about who they're going to fire and who they're going to hire. And it's certainly there's an opportunity in the Middle East because I think people are sick and tired of all the death and suffering and conflict. And sure, people are opinionated and even arrogant in a lot of cases. But at the same time, I think there's enough adults in the room, or maybe you call them modern thinking people or just decent people who say, all right, guys, let's figure it out here. Like we can do better. It's really not that complicated, but it just comes from decent people joining forces and saying, all right, let's work it out. Let's come to the table. Let's start talking and figure it out. And for, all his faults, Donald Trump is someone who really enjoys being the deal maker. In some ways, like that's the ethos or the mystery of the man is, what kind of deals can he cook up? So, if he could sort of rise to his better angels, he could have a very effective presidency. So very interesting times. He's inherited a very interesting. I see it as an opportunity, actually.
Yeah, that's another distinction we talk about it is people aren't fixed or fixed points. They're not like always the same. So there is, I like what you said, Matt, you're the better angels. That's something we all deal with, right? Like we find ourselves growing and changing and evolving when we have a chance to listen to our better angels or transform conversations or just our understandings of life. And so yeah, I think that's actually a really cool opportunity is that maybe we're all growing up. There's a lot more adults in the room now than there ever was. And so the humanity's maturing, and that could really change the landscape. So, we also wanted to do one more thing, Bill, which is to sort of future cast a little bit together with you, which is, what do you see as possible in the Middle East Peace Civic Forum going forward? We're going into 2025. If you're into astrology, I am a little bit. Today is the last official day of the era of Pisces, and we're going into the age of Aquarius, which is what people always talked about. The age of Aquarius, it's time of peace, And so I'm not big into that, but there's a lot of truth to the cycles we go through as all together as a humanity. So we're moving into this new age. And someone said that the 19th, 20th, and 21st are the last days. So it's very appropriate. We're here together crafting conversations for the future, like what future we want to live into. So what do you see as opportunities for Middle East Peace Civic Forum to take on together going forward? Have you you have any like insights or ideas or things you'd like to see happen in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of times in the conversations, I've said, look, there's a lot of other groups that I'm seeing, just groups that you've introduced me to online. Um, what's the potential for joining with those groups and having joint discussions? I think there's enormous potential because if you've got a group of 100 people following you and there's someone else with a group of 500 people following them and you've got another group of 200, that's an awful lot of people more than you've got right now. And so to look to other groups, to look to join, to do joint activities, uh, I I think that's going to be the route, in my
Yeah.
opinion,
Well, I
for
think
the
we
people
do
that count.
we do something very well, which is facilitate. Everyone here is trained in leadership, facilitation, holding space for at at a kind of a few clicks back, right? We're all very meta here at the table. So yeah, so this is probably an interesting opportunity to talk to is to and because we're interested in media and podcasting and critical conversation is to continue to facilitate groups. We did that on our last call, which was pretty successful. We had three different leaders of different groups in the same conversation. It was, and we facilitated that, and I experienced a lot of connections happening and actually teaming up. So we actually saw all three groups as potentially like parts of the same process, right? One was dealing with healing, one was dealing with like head first into the situation right now, and one was sort of crafting an ideal, almost aspirational, like constitution of what's possible. And then the three together made sense in a collaborative way. So continuing, and I'm just reflecting what you said is like we moving forward in 2025, we can do more facilitating of groups,
Yeah,
not just individuals, but what groups are up to. Everyone likes a podcast because they get to share their voice, so facilitators, that's a really good space for us to succeed in and expand.
yeah,
And I think part of it also is modeling, is that we get to model. We may not have all the conversations under our roof, but we can model a methodology and even just a spirit of how we talk to each other and how we kind of dive deep into different challenges and how we relate to each other as human beings. Just try to honor each other and treat each other with dignity and respect in an environment where that's too often lacking.
yeah, indeed. And by the way, a lot of your terminology comes from NLP. Modeling comes from NLP. Matching and mirroring comes from NLP. Recreating comes from NLP. They all come from NLP. This is
We
language
have
which before the 1970s was never used because nobody
That's
thought of
right.
it.
I think our founder, Werner Erhard, was a deep dive into all of this stuff. This was the 70s. There was a lot of new territory being discovered, a lot of new technologies, a lot of East meeting West. So actually a lot of our NLP and distinctions come from Eastern philosophy of the observer and um, creating a listening. I think it's so I think we're all sort of an amalgamate of the tumultuous 60s and 70s, and then people learning to put technological overlays over these like new areas, and then they became organizations, they became training modules, they became projects, and so we're sort of the fruit probably of a lot of that, those early pioneers. I think we have funny stories in our organization, like when it used to be called something else. Gosh, what was it? I think S training, before it became a kind of a more structured uh, corporation. And so people tell a lot of stories of like you'd have to really, like for 7 days you'd disappear into a workshop, and they'd kick your butt, and like there was a lot of rumors. It was there was I heard Werner Erhard used to start each S training. He would just everyone would be like, okay, welcome everyone, and everyone's here, and then he'd just shout at the top of his lungs like, you guys have your head so far up your beep, that you don't know what the hell's going on, and really like just shock everybody into like, this is not going to be a fun workshop. You got to do some work, and you really don't know what you're talking about. So a lot of people joke about that, like, well, those are the early days, right? The pioneering. So we're probably much more civilized and kind of now we're all on Zoom.
That's debatable.
It's debatable.
Yeah.
So,
But yeah, go ahead, Matt. Maybe we'll wrap up and then
yeah, I just wanted to say the words cancel culture, because that's something that I think is like we have to be willing to push back on to some degree. It's like, we want to kill people off. We want to, just be right about things, and just we approach communication as an argument or debate or coming from an agenda and trying to prove things right. And then if someone doesn't fit in that mold, or they, it's like we go hunting for some foible of people so that we can cancel them and cancel what they have to say. So how do we push back against that in a world that's social media driven and soundbite driven?
Mm. Well, again, it's a bit like war. Someone who's got a different opinion from you is wrong, and they need to be got rid of or shut up, and so on, so that the people that believe what we believe can be heard. It can't happen, and in fact, it's a huge step backwards, isn't it? When you think about the cancel culture, that's exactly what leads to war in the first place. It's somebody saying, you don't have a right to exist, you don't have a right to say what you say, you don't have a right to believe what you believe. Who says? Who says?
Right, right. Well, does that make us revolutionaries?
Well, I think it makes you a revolutionary if you just don't accept it and say, no, I'm sorry, I don't accept any of that. I'm not going to be
Yeah,
that.
yeah. We get to love each other. We get to talk honestly. We get to be with the pain of things that we may not agree with and talk it through 6, 7 times, whatever it takes, and spread the good word as far as we can.
Well,
uh,
like for example, in the Red Cross, I did some work with the Red Cross for a number of years, and there was one time when I was called in to try and resolve a problem between two teams, the disaster relief team and the team which was responsible for the disaster preparedness in all of the 169 um, societies, the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. So there was these two teams that were based in Geneva in the head office, and they were meant to cooperate because the disaster relief team would rush out to a flood or to an earthquake and set up cholera relief camps and control things medically. But then, of course, there was always the national society in that country and the surrounding countries that would help and aid putting things right afterwards. And so one should hand over from the other. That was how it was meant to work. In fact, what happened was these two teams were at war, would you believe, at war for several years. And the Secretary General was getting fed up with having UN agencies and other organizations saying, what's going on with your health team? We can't seem to get any sense out of them. And he said, look, I'm fed up with this. Somebody solve it now. And they called on me. And somebody said to me, Bill, are you going to be working with health teams? And I said, yeah, it seems like it. I said, honestly, if you value your reputation, don't. And I said, why is that? He said, it can't be solved. They are really so deeply entrenched, they will not listen. So I said, well, unfortunately, I've already said yes. Um, so both teams said, we want to talk to you first. So I said, well, I'm going to talk to them first. Just, I had to pick one, so I picked one. And there were about 10 people in this team. And they said, look, the trouble with the other group, the other lot is they're just arrogant, stupid, and they're just so full of themselves that they won't listen. And and of course, the other team said, the trouble with that team is they're so petty-minded, they're details, nitpickers, and they just won't listen to anything. And so I could see why they were at war. I spent 3 days with them up in a mountain. In fact, funny enough, we drove up to this place, went into this hotel, and it had started snowing as we arrived. And within 2 hours, the snow was 10 feet up to the windows.
They couldn't leave it.
You're not going anywhere. Where was
3 days,
this?
in Switzerland.
Okay.
They were, I think they were
Neutral
meant to spend
country.
2 days. Well, of course, remember Switzerland is where the Red Cross and all these
I see.
anyway. But what happened was, I think we were meant to spend 2 days, but we ended up spending 3 because we just couldn't get out. And we had a big picture window with Mont Blanc in the distance, and we had some fabulous views while they were going on. And all these two groups were saying to me all the time was, when are we going to have the row? When are we going to have the argument? When are we going to? I said, don't worry, look, we got so much to do before we get to that. And of course, what happened in the end was, I said, look, let's use a process called future basing, where you decide, let's say it's going to be a year's time, and both of you have actually come to an agreement. In fact, it's a time when you're operating the way you were meant to, when you were really effective, when you really affected this organization. And they played the game, and they went through that. And in the end, they said to the organization, this is the new face of the health teams. This is how we operate together from now on. And they felt that they should be merged. And in fact, a year later, they were.
Wow.
Yeah. And
Well, excellent.
Oh, Bill, it's a great story. Maybe Matt, just for the sake of time, why don't you share with our audience how to connect to Middle East Pacific Forum, how to connect with Bill, and then I'd love to hear from some of our other participants tonight and get some. There's been some really good questions in the chat, and how about that?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that. So, Bill, to get in touch with you, your LinkedIn profile, just search for your name, right?
That's right. Yeah. And
Phillips.
NLP, Bill Phillips. NLP.
Very good. Very good. So if anyone would like to get in touch with Bill, that's how to do it. Any takeaway? Well, let me go into the contact information because I want people to have that. So first of all, everyone can check out our website. It's www.mepcf.org. That stands for the Middle East Peace Civic Forum. You can type it all out if you want, but that's not necessary. Then we've got our YouTube channel. It's called Peace Tribe Rising / Middle East Peace Civic Forum. You can search for it and subscribe. So please subscribe so you get updates with all of our new content. And sometimes we'll do live streaming events. So go check that out. And then, of course, wherever you get your podcasts, go check out the Peace Tribe Rising podcast and subscribe to that. You'll get a notice when we publish new episodes. And we just want everyone to be involved. We're always looking for partners. And of course, we need funding to be able to continue this work. And if we can raise several $100,000, we can bring a group of peacemakers to Switzerland and bring our facilitation team together there. And we can all go and really have some very deep and meaningful and thorough discussion. So it'd be a very good investment. So anyone who's looking to make a philanthropic commitment to peace in the Middle East, you can send your checks to the Middle East Peace Civic Forum. And I don't know, what does it cost for someone to get a front row seat in Switzerland, Peter?
I don't know.
50,000, you can participate in person in Switzerland. But it'd probably be, I don't know, 250, $300,000 to do a full conference, program with multiple conferences and guests coming in from different places and feeding them and housing them. But most important, just getting to meet person to person and talk through these very deep and important issues. And like we said, be a model for how it's done. And it's certainly not going to happen just with our own efforts. It's going to take a multinational effort of government and civil society and religious leaders all coming together. But basically, decent people saying enough is enough. Let's live together in peace and talk it through and figure it out. So, so with that, Bill, any concluding remarks you'd like to make? Any key takeaway for you that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
And to be honest, no, I I want to still be involved with the Middle East Peace Forum. I think it has good um, good vibes, and you're doing good work, and certainly I believe in what you're doing, and I'll
Thank you,
continue to
Bill.
be involved.
Thank you. Thank
We
you.
appreciate you so much. And one of the reasons we wanted to focus this podcast on you is to really get to know you better and your background and the skills you bring. And we're excited to do more. It's going to be a great year, 2025, and we're going to grow and take a lot of your advice today as well into our work.
Absolutely. And we have with us today Artie Bethia. He's a member of our team here. And you've been listening in as an audience member on this conversation. We had some others who had to leave, but Artie's still here. Artie, any questions you have for Bill or anything you'd like to say at this juncture?
Well, I really enjoyed your communication, Bill. I enjoyed your communication very much. I was sitting there thinking when you were using the word but. I was facilitating one time. I said, if we get the buts out of the way, it's a possibility we all can see clearly. And so,
Move your butt.
yeah, move your butt out of the way. And so I really enjoyed everything. And as Bill said, I remember you said something that if the information that this platform, if we can say something in this platform, can go viral, wherein that the right people are listening to what has been said, perhaps produce an idea that one may say, you know what, let's try Jesus' idea. His idea was to make himself wrong. He became wrong that everybody else can be right. He gave up something. He gave up something. He gave up being right. And I think if both sides would just stop and just give up being right, perhaps we can come to some sort of solution in agreement and live together. But as long as we making one another wrong. And also, Bill, I realized too that the reason why when Christ came on the scene, he said, I didn't come to condemn nobody, to make anybody wrong, but I come to save the predicament, save people from the predicament they are in, from their point of view, from their opinions, and give something up to come together in love. That's all I have to say. I'm complete.
Thanks, Artie. What are we willing to give up?
Yeah, somebody need to give something up.
Yeah,
Give up something.
Yeah. Well, people, they get very attached to their views, but I think people can give up that their story is the only one that has validity. Everyone deserves a life. Everyone needs to be able to live their life. And that's something that's part of being mutually responsible.
and Matt, I think Myra's back on. Why don't we check in with her? Looks like I think she's on, and maybe we can hear
Myra, can you be with us?
All right, let's check in with Myra. Myra, are you with us?
It's so great being here with you all. And the subject's very close to my heart. I have a dual citizenship, American and Israeli. I lived in Israel. I've been to Gaza. I've seen the Palestinian villages and how people live. And, having seen that, I could really get why there's a conflict. You have the Israelis who live, it's like, it's the Garden of Eden. And you have the Palestinian villages that are so poor. Gaza, this was 50 years ago. Nothing has changed. Nothing that I can see. But I think my question is how to address the financial end of this conflict. Arafat was worth over $1 billion, did not take care of the Palestinian people. And the head of Hamas right now is worth over $4 billion. It doesn't seem like they take care of the people. And, the United States and Russia are a business, and their business is arms and providing. They keep the conflicts. How do we address the financial side of this?
Right, profiteering from war, and
It really, yes.
that's a big one. That's the elephant in the room for me too. Myra is like, follow the money, and actually you'll see oil. Chevron and the war machines are profiting from war, and they always have, and it's a source of tremendous profit. So yeah, like I think that's being exposed more and more. I think that was, manufactured consent, I call it, or manufactured narratives that create good guys and bad guys, helps promote war, keeps the engine going, right? So, if you buy that other humans are your enemy, you're fueling the fire. So I think people are waking up to this manufactured propaganda more and more because of the way communication's opening up. I just heard about Musk today launching a whole new satellite system for broadcasting around the world with his satellite system. So, people are now much more exposed to information than ever before. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but who's controlling the narrative is really the elephant in the room. So freedom of speech.
Well, and Bill, you are phenomenal. I have so loved hearing you and what you have to say. And I think you definitely, you got to get to the people that are going to make the difference. Yeah. And absolutely. Mm-hmm. Except when you're making all the money, people don't want to let go of that.
Yeah.
Forget the conflict. Forget the whole Jewish, Palestinian, Arab, whatever. And look, you could be sitting, I say this all the time, you could be sitting in a cafe in Israel having a great conversation with someone who was just lovely, and they're a Palestinian. And then on the other hand, you have the Israelis cutting the Palestinians off from their olive trees, and you take all day to get to pick their olives. So there's so many little pieces to this. It's just like, how do we make it stop? Just stop it already.
Yeah, that's what it takes, isn't it?
Well, I think when you spoke of Northern Ireland and how many people, it took a world of people to go in there and say, this is enough. Werner Erhard went and met with all the religious leaders in Northern Ireland. And there's so many, you said it, Bill, there's so many people that had a part in bringing peace to Northern Ireland. And it shows us that it's possible. So bringing peace to the Middle East is possible. It is possible.
I think simply it requires a will to make it happen. And unless there's that will, it will take longer.
Yeah. I went on a trip with some people when I was in graduate school to Israel, and it was organized by this guy, Yehezkel Dror, who's an Israeli academic, and he talked a lot about dystopia.
Mm.
So part of what can sometimes motivate people is if we keep going in the present direction, it's going to get worse and worse and be a dystopia. So instead of that, let's create the utopia. What is the good thing that we can create? Because if you go straight to the good thing, people don't buy it. But people can definitely buy the dystopian scenario. So that sometimes gets people attention and says, all right, let's summon forth the will to not end up in the dystopia.
Yeah. Yeah. I have an architecture focus in my career, and we have this fun, like, there's a fun focus in our world called solar punk. And solar punk is like a positive utopian vision of the future. And people make all this artwork with, solar panels and free energy and permaculture and shared communities, and they create these beautiful visuals. So it's sort of the future casting for a utopia. And because usually it's the opposite, like what is it, cyberpunk is sort of like always a little bit dystopian and dark. So there's some fun art that's happening around solar punk.
Cool.
We need more of it, don't we?
Yeah. Well, Israel and Palestine is such a small place with what, 15 million people, something like that. And in the grand scheme of the face of the earth, it's such a tiny little place, but could have such an enormous impact if we can all just figure out how to live together. So that's the opportunity of it. And I think it's an opportunity that's worth talking about. It's not really naive to talk about what could be between Israelis and Palestinians. It's it's worthy of considering and working for. Why not?
If it could be solved, let's face it, it's the most complex situation that we have, isn't it, in war. If that could be solved, it would be a lesson to everyone, to the whole world.
Exactly.
Because if that could be solved, anything could be solved.
From your mouth to God's ears, Bill.
Voilà.
All right. Thank you all. I declare this podcast complete.
All right. Take care. Great
Bye for
being
now.
with you all.
Bye bye.